Hello and welcome to this podcast from the BBC World Service. Please let us know what you think and tell other people about us on social media. Podcasts from the BBC World Service are supported by advertising.
You're listening to a podcast from the BBC World Service. This is Hard Talk with me, Stephen Sacker. Thanks for downloading this edition of the programme. I do hope you enjoy it. Today I've journeyed to the south coast of England to meet one of the great female pioneers in photojournalism, Marilyn Stafford. She was born in Cleveland, Ohio, moved to Paris in search of a singing career, but almost by accident discovered she had a major talent as a photographer. She won the admiration of the great French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson, and like him, she loved to capture intimate pictures of ordinary people on the streets rather than in the studio. In the course of her career, she became one of the very few women photographers to challenge the male domination of Fleet Street. She combined journeys to conflict zones with glamorous fashion shoots, and her portraits of 20th century icons like Albert Einstein and Edith Piaf are familiar to many. But she never won the international fame of some of her male peers. But now, aged 93, Marilyn Stafford's work is being admired by a new generation. And I'm delighted to say she joins me now. Marilyn Stafford, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
Let's start way back. You trained as an actress. You spent a while as a nightclub singer, and yet you really found your creative voice in photography. What was it about photography that really reached into your soul?
I have been called an accidental photographer because I really did not set out to do the photography at all. The photography was something that was just there. When I was a child, everybody had a little box brownie. Every family had a little box brownie. And so the photography was just part of life. It wasn't anything. It wasn't photography. It was just you had a camera and you took pictures.
Would you say you were a natural observer, sometimes a little bit removed and looking in on things?
I think probably yes. I think probably, to explain it to you, I remember taking my first photograph and why I took my first photograph. It was on a family picnic and we were by a stream. And the stream was of very, very clear water running over pebbles. It wasn't very deep. And I was standing in it, in this stream, and feeling emotional watching the water over the stones. And I just had this urge. I want to have this remembered, the feeling remembered.
Which is very interesting because it leads immediately to a thought about your association in Paris. Once you'd given up on the acting and you'd moved to Paris and you were doing some singing, but you were also beginning to use your camera, you got to meet one of the greatest 20th century photographers, Henri Cartier-Bresson. And his thing was about capturing that decisive moment, being ready and understanding the importance of the moment. And that seems to have resonated with you.
That resonated with me in relation again to the feeling, because it was what was said in the photograph was what I wanted to bring out. As a child, I was open to Life magazine with photography, and also I went to the cinema, and there were newsreels. I saw what was going around, and I suppose there was a churning of that same emotion of I want to capture something and say something. But I was very moved by what was happening around me. I really became interested in documentary photography rather than just taking the water rolling over the stones.
So it was a desire to, in a sense, to tell stories.
Absolutely.
And the stories of people.
Absolutely. And I think that I am really a storyteller at heart. And I want to tell stories. but I want the stories to mean something. And I also want the stories to produce an effect at the end.
But if we are talking now about those early years of photography, the late 40s, early 1950s, you were a woman in a man's world. And I'm thinking of some of your very well-known pictures in one of the inner slums of Paris, where you spent days and days filming, particularly street children. You must have been quite peculiar to the local people. This American woman with a camera constantly taking pictures.
Well, it's interesting that you should say that, because when I went out photographing with Cartier-Bresson, that's exactly what happened. He was very tall, he wore a hat, and his little Leica was up here. I was very small, and I was a woman, and I was carrying a Rolleiflex, which was a big camera. And this was post-war France. You didn't walk around and see many people, let alone a woman, taking photographs. So in a funny kind of way, I was a decoy for him, because I would be there with my big camera, and he was able to tower above me, and nobody would notice him.
What do you think Cartier-Bresson taught you? Because he loved your work. He was something of a mentor to you.
Absolutely.
What was it, do you think, that he saw in you?
I couldn't tell you. I really don't know what was going on in his mind. I only know that he never taught directly, in the sense that when I would show him a photograph, he would say, now this is what you have to do, and all that sort of thing. He never behaved like that. He would make gentle suggestions. If you framed it this way, it would have that kind of a sense coming out. But leaving it this way, it doesn't bring out that feeling. And one of the things I learned from him was, if you're going out in the street, especially, be unobtrusive. And this lasted for the whole of my life.
And you, it seems, really like being outside, and in particular in sort of spontaneous moments with ordinary people. I think you made a conscious decision to avoid studio work as much as possible.
Yes. I think you could say that from one point of view, that was because of the technology, and I am not a technical person. I just hated the whole business of cables on the floor and lights. And I prefer natural light as it comes, and the documentary approach rather than the studio setup.
It seems to me you wanted to find raw subject matter. I mean, for example, you went off to North Africa, to Tunisia during the terrible French war to try and prevent Algerian independence. The French were bombing villages. You went off to Tunisia, where refugees were pouring over the border, having been forced from their homes, and some of your pictures, again, caused a stir. I think one was on the front page of the Observer newspaper at the time.
It was my first front page.
Yeah. So you were close to that world of war photography for a time, even if you didn't go right into it.
But I wasn't interested in the war. I was interested in the refugees. Post-World War II, there were a lot of what they called at the time misplaced people. But before that, there were also people who were misplaced, who were migrants. I was very moved, again when I was younger, by the photographs of Dorothea Lange, who filmed or photographed the migrant workers who had to move because of the Dust Bowl and the winds.
And the Great Depression.
And the Great Depression. As a child, people would come to the door selling little rags and things. There were the Jewish refugees from the oncoming Holocaust. I was made aware of all of these people who were in danger, who needed their story told. And I wanted to tell the story of the people in Algeria who were refugees. And who had been totally uplifted from their homes. Nobody was talking about the refugees.
And that focus on people in the gravest of circumstances who had suffered so much, I just wonder what impact that had upon you. I'm very mindful, not so long ago I interviewed Don McCullin, the great British war and conflict photographer, and he says this, he says, sometimes on assignments in war zones, sometimes I felt like I was not carrying the negatives so much as pieces of human flesh back home with me. It was as if I was carrying the suffering of the people I had photographed. Did that kind of intense, deep emotional response come for you too?
Of course. It can't but do so. When you see people in terrible situations, you want to do something. And maybe through the photography, one can do something. I believe it can do something.
You think photographs can change things?
Possibly not as we think of change as this becomes that immediately. But I think it can bring thoughts to people. And certainly there are very iconic photographs, which you will remember, which make people think.
You clearly had that campaigning spirit as a photojournalist.
Yes.
And yet I'm also mindful of your personal life, because even when you were covering the Algerian war and the refugees, you were heavily pregnant.
Yes.
And it is often different for women, because
yes.
they do have to bear children if they choose to have children. And
sure.
that, of course, has a huge impact on their lives. And we've reflected already on the degree to which photography was a man's world. Do you, when you look at the arc of your career, think that in the end, some of the choices you made, for example, later in your career specializing a lot in fashion rather than traveling quite so much to difficult places, was it partly driven by being a mother, by choices you had to make in your personal life?
You know, when I came to England in the mid-60s, there were probably about 10, 12 women photographers on Fleet Street. Of those, most of them were doing feature-type photography, not news, and the door was pretty much closed against women. I came here, and I had separated from my husband by then. I had a small child. I had to earn a living. The only open door was fashion, because fashion, homes, decoration was women's area. And so I had to go there. And I was able to get work in the fashion area.
But, I mean, to be blunt about it, did men who, by and large, ran the newspapers back then and ran the picture desks and the news desks, did they actively at times work against the interests of women, actually belittle women, seek to keep women out?
There were some men who were marvelous and really helped me, and I'm very grateful to them, because as they were the ones in power, so to speak, they helped open the door. There were the others who were exactly like you say. I remember going to a very big film company and asking for work as a stills photographer. And this smug gentleman said, "Have just the right job for you." And he said, "We have a scene that's going to need you to get out on the wing of an airplane in the sky and shoot from there." And I just looked at him and said, "I'm sorry, I don't do that sort of thing." And he said, "Well, there you are. You can't hire women. They won't do these things." Well, I am sure that there are some men who would not have wanted that sort of thing either.
One thing you did do, and it actually began very early, even before you left the United States, was from time to time you got the opportunity to film in sort of stills portrait terms some of the iconic people of the 20th century, starting, I suppose, with Albert Einstein. You got the most incredible opportunity to go to his home and photograph him. Later it was Indira Gandhi, and a host of other famous names, Edith Piaf at one point in Paris. When you were faced with that, with the challenge of capturing something about these world-famous people, how did you go about it?
I suppose with naivete, I just felt I could do it. And I'm not really a thinker, a planner, or anything. I just go with my feeling. And the Albert Einstein thing was, first of all, he was so gentle and kind. He made us very welcome. I went there with these documentary filmmakers who wanted him to speak out against the atom bomb, and he did in the film. But before we were filming, or they were filming, it was all on 16mm film at the time. There was the producer and the director. And while the lights were being set up, the director was talking to him. And he looked at the director and he said, "I have a question for you. Can you please explain to me about how many feet per second the film goes through the camera?" And the director explained all of this. I couldn't explain it to you. And Einstein listened there like a little boy. And after all of this had clarified, he said, "Thank you very much. I understand now."
And given your access to these remarkable people and photographs that, you know, live long in the memory and continue to be looked at today, do you, going back to this point about photography in your era being by and large a man's world, a man's profession, do you feel that you never quite got the recognition that your male peers got?
No, not really. I was doing my work and I just did it. I didn't think in terms of recognition at all.
You worked a lot in fashion, as you've described
Yes.
it. You weren't so much a catwalk photographer, but you did a lot of glamour and fashion. I mean, if I look at, and I have looked at a lot of your fashion photography, you did do it in a particular way, which was quite different from a lot of others working in the field at the time. For example, you often included ordinary people in your fashion shots. You'd have this beautiful woman wearing beautiful clothes, but then in the corner of the picture or to one side, there'd be just a passerby
Yes.
or a kid who happened to be watching. And you let them be in the picture.
Yes. Well, partly that was because in the early days, in the 50s, when I was doing fashion, it was the early time of ready-to-wear. I was also having my love affair with the streets of Paris. And it pleased me to take these clothes, which would be worn by women like me, in places where I would be walking about. And of course, in some of these places were the local kids. And of course, any place you go with a camera, you're going to have masses of kids trailing behind you. And so I figured, get them in the act as well. And they loved it. And they had a wonderful time, and I had a wonderful time. The models had a wonderful time. And I think that the photographs had a little joie de vivre. You know, they weren't just fashion photographs. They were fun photographs.
When you look today at the celebrities with their stylists and their image controllers, and everything is so orchestrated, could you be a photographer in that world today, under that sort of control?
I suppose if I had to earn my living, I would do it. One does do certain things because of necessity. And some of the photographs that I did were out of necessity. I had to survive. I had a child. And I set up at a given moment a small agency with another photographer to cover the fashions in Paris, Milan, Rome, New York, London, 4 or 5 times a year. And I was earning my living with this kind of photography, and it allowed me to work very intensely 4 times a year and have enough money to go and do the kind of photographs that I wanted to do. For instance, 7 or 8 trips to India, and to pay the bills.
Which brings us to the present day and your determination to promote women in the sort of campaigning documentary journalism that you've talked about, and which obviously is your first love in your own career. You've got a prize now in your name set up by the Photo Document Group, which seeks out the best woman documentary photographer. What do you think defines the best of this campaigning documentary photography that you're talking about, whether it be social, economic, environmental? What is it, do you think, that defines it?
It's really the way that the photograph is taken to tell a story. It's all telling stories. And the winners of the 2 years that this award has been going are telling stories that people rarely hear about, and they are also showing in some way either a way that this problem that they're showing can be solved or helped, or what is being done or trying to be done. The 3 winners of this year's award, one is a Turkish woman who is revealing the story of young Syrian refugees in Turkey, women who are married off, very often probably sold by their families to survive. And then after they've been used up a bit, they're cast off, they're divorced. Another of the winners is writing about female genital mutilization in Europe. She's presently in France doing this story. Another woman is showing the plight of the villages in Wales where there have been mines that have been closed, how the people are pulling themselves up, and the ravages of the closures of the mines, but how the people are helping themselves and what is being done to help them. And in other words, it's a negative situation that is showing what could be done or what is being done if only people would get in there and do it.
Sounds to me like you believe in the power of the picture, the power of photography, as much today as you did when you started out right after World War II.
I think so, yes, very much. In one image, there can be a very big emotional thrust that makes people think, feel, and I hope do something about that feeling.
Marilyn Stafford, it has been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for being on Hard Talk.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Linda.
And I'm Mercy.
And we're the presenters of a new podcast from the BBC World Service called
Parentland. I'm a mum of 2 and a portrait and documentary photographer.
And I'm also a mum of 2 and a science journalist. Parentland is a place you can come if you're interested in kids, why they do the things they do, and how to make them do what you want them to do.
So if you have any burning questions about raising a child,
whether it's babies, toddlers, kids, teenagers,
Parentland is the place to be.
We're very much focused on evidence. So we're going to be speaking to scientists, researchers, doctors.
Yeah, and this is a really global podcast. So we want to have questions from all over the world. It doesn't matter where you're from, what your culture has to say about it. We'll try as much as possible to tackle it.
Yeah, because I think a lot of the issues parents face are global issues. They're universal issues.